Yes, thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon to all of you. Good evening to our friends from Australia, and good morning to friends from other parts of the world. A warm welcome to all of you for a very important event of SCARF. It's a kind of a celebration. It's a celebration during a very difficult times. We hope that all of you have been safe over the past 9 months, and it's been a really it's been a difficult time through the past 9 months, and almost I could say it was a routine changer. And we hope you'll all continue to remain safe, although the situation is not yet over. Today we have two important events. The first of these events includes the release of the book, which is the story of SCARF. It's the story of what we were, what we are, and what we are going to be in the future. It's very heartening to have two very important global people with us on this platform, Dr. Benedetto and Dr. Mogan Agashe, who will be receiving the book. And it's really a matter of pride for us that it's Dr. Sarada Menon herself, who is the founder advisor of SCARF, who's going to be, handing over, I could almost say it's her story that she has been handing over. And the second event for today is the second Dr. Sarada Menon Oration to be delivered by Dr. Francis Dark from Brisbane, Australia. And welcome, Francis, to this very important occasion. And Professor Helen Killaspy is going to be the chair, again, a very appropriate person to chair this oration. And I will tell you more about her in a bit. It's very exciting and humbling to see people from across all over the world to be here with us today. And it's really a kind of recognition for what SCARF is today. I really feel very proud that we are having this celebration, although I would have loved to have all of you all with us in person. But I think the virtual field too offers a lot of togetherness. I welcome all of you all to this event. Dr. Tara has been instrumental in conceptualizing the idea of the book. She's planned every single detail and has tirelessly worked to taking it forward to its completion, as you will see it today. I request Dr. Tara to tell us more about this journey of chronicling the history of SCARF. Over to you, Tara.
Yeah, thank you, Padma, and hello to everybody. As Padma rightly put it, it is indeed a very proud and happy day for us for more than one reason. This idea of writing a book on the history of SCARF is something that we have been talking about, but we just decided that we will set a time deadline for it so that we really push ourselves to do it. And the reason we think it is very important for any organization, whether it is government, NGO, corporate, to keep documenting their work, and which would ultimately come out as a very nice piece of book. I think that is extremely important, and I would urge all of you who are working in organizations to do this. We also felt that if we were to pay tribute to our founders, then it should be done at a time when they would be able to savor it and they would be able to enjoy it, rather than much later. So that is why I think all of us gave ourselves this hard push to make sure that Dr. Sarada Menon, as you know, is one of the greatest names in psychiatry, in mental health, not only in India, but in the world. And we have had the fortune to have worked with her for many years, worked with her very closely, known her personally, known her professionally. So we decided to dedicate this book to Madam Dr. Sarada Menon. And as you glance through the book, you will find that she has made such an immense contribution in all facets of mental health. And this indeed reflects on the history of SCARF and the growth of SCARF. I have many, many people to thank. It's a long list, but I would say that I'm immensely grateful to the Honorable Vice President of India, Shri Venkaiah Naidu, and the two top bureaucrats in Tamil Nadu, Shri Hansraj Verma, who is Additional Chief Secretary, and our own Dynamic Health Secretary, Dr. Radhakrishnan, all of whom sent messages, and many others across the globe who have sent messages in no time. In a matter of a week, I got replies from all of you, and I'm indeed very, very grateful to that. And also to Dr. Soumya Swaminathan of WHO, who was kind enough to write the foreword for this book. And our own staff, employees, both in the past, like Mr. Raju, and the current employees of the organization. I have all of them to thank. And finally, as Padma said, Dr. Mohan Agashe and Dr. Benedetto, who will be also speaking on the book. As I told you, there are two things which I want to say. One is, please document. We failed to document because we were preoccupied with many, many other things. But now I realize how important it is to document, because we are all advancing in years and we now have to rely on our memory to put together facts of the book. And the second thing is, try and be as inclusive as possible when you plan a book of this nature. Try and bring in all facets of the organization's work and all the people concerned, whether it is your driver or clerical staff or the director or the chairman. I also have to thank the SCARF board, the president, the chairman of the board, and all the members. But finally, there are two wonderful women with whom I have worked very closely, and I want Minnie and Malvika to please come on screen, please. Yes. So one, yeah, hi.
Hi.
The one, yes, yeah, please wave out to people so that they know who you are. So these two wonderful women, I have been working very, very closely for the last 3 months. I didn't know them from Adam before. And Minnie Amirapu, who helped us a lot with the writing, editing, and just about everything. And Malvika Mehra, who did the wonderful designing. People who have seen the book, you will understand how good the design has been and how well both of them have developed the concepts that you see in the book. I'm indeed, as I have mentioned in the book, these two women have given it the shape and the sheen and the shine. And I'm indeed extremely grateful to both of you. And if any of you guys want to write a book, please make use of their services. I would strongly recommend that because they've been excellent, as I said, professionally and personally. So with this, I stop, and I would urge all of you to go through the book and give us a feedback. The PDF will be there on our website very soon. You can have a look at it. And those of you who want a hard copy, I always say maybe 60 plus would prefer a hard copy, you know. It's always easier. I'll send you one, Benedetto, don't worry. So, we'll be happy to send you hard copies as well. And with this, as I said, I'm extremely happy to be doing this. And I also wish the oration all success responses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tara. Now I would request Dr. Sarada Menon to say a few words and show us the copy of the book. Show everyone the copy of the book. Over to you, madam.
Distinguished delegates to this conference, to this meeting, Dr. Helen Killaspy, Dr. Francis Dag, Dr. Benedetto Saraceno, and dear Mohan Agashe, and my dear friends and colleagues. I welcome you all once again, and to the compliments of the season and Chennai, I hand over to you. Many of those who are gathered here are known to me, others not at all. But some are working, but we are always working for a common cause, whether we know each other or not. I would like to start with a vote of thanks, expressing my gratitude, deep appreciation, and speechless wonder to the organizers of this program, presenting me with a book dedicated to me and related to my undying passion and grandiose ambition still to be achieved to rehabilitate and restore to normalcy those afflicted by mental illness and its complications. The book talks about the birth and growth of SCARF, an organization determined to achieve the above desires. The compilation has been really thorough. The illustrations superb. The overall layout excellent. The title is Caring for the Mind, a Journey of 35 Years. And the final touch is where it mirrors a lady returning from Paris after her final debut at becoming a lady. I thank all those who contributed, but I would especially like to mention Dr. Rajkumar, Dr. Tara, Dr. Garyali, Dr. Padma, Dr. Shanta Kamath, and Mr. Raju, and the Mahalingams. Those in our grateful memories include Mr. K.R. Baliga and Mr. Velodi. These persons were with me during the stormy period of delivery and adolescence. I am indeed happy and proud that there are so many whom I cannot mention here, who gracefully stood by to help, support, and work with commitment in this strange endeavor. Now, I was told to find out whether there was any need for such a book. I say yes. Most important, I would say, is that those who work for SCARF all along, right from the last lowest person to the director or chairman or whoever it is, who have contributed, would like to see their names and illustrations of their work in this book. Otherwise, it's all lost. Wouldn't you like to know that what you're doing today will be known by your grandchild sometime later? So I'm quite sure it makes people very happy for that. After all, then mental illness has been there for quite a long time. And how their people were being managed, what happened over the years is interesting to know. So, therefore, from a state of chaos, lack of understanding, and ways of management, with no support from the family and environment, total neglect, we have come a long way to now where knowledge is better, attitude much more favorable, and treatment available. And the need for research and progress through sympathetic kindness available. I would like to mention here 3 organizations. There are many, many organizations in India doing this work, each according to requirements of the area, funds available, the environment, the people, and so on. I would just like to mention these 3 because anyone reading the book can go through what happened in those days, how they managed to do what they are doing and continue to do. Now let me see. The first is a lady of 60 years with expertise over 25 years in this field, starting when services were more organized and treatment available, but inadequate accommodation, staff, basic needs, clinical services, rehabilitation, and research were not there. However, working with them, observing the patients with the treatment, and seeing them come to a state of employability gave the idea that this could be proceeded with further, whatever was being done. And so the ambition was to rehabilitate, recovery, restoration, independence, integration, and removal of stigma. These ideas came to this lady, and they are praiseworthy, no doubt, but the plans and method are very evasive. In a casual discussion of this idea, a young psychiatrist, male, just was ready, qualified, well motivated, ready for anything that is new, joined us. And a lady, well qualified, intelligent, young, eager to progress, with a King Midas's touch, joined after that. Secondly, two young ladies, paraprofessionals in psychiatry, during driving from work, saw a woman on the road, well qualified to be labeled homeless, mentally ill, and took her to a shelter and started work with her. They had the knowledge and being in social work, were motivated and assisted by their peer group and started the Banyan youth, partly qualified, modern, had new policies and new methods. This organization is doing very well. The third person, a businessman, over 50 years, not connected with the specialty at all, found a boy lying on the road next to his house. He felt sad for him and went to him and took him up, brought him to his house, gave him food, shelter, everything, looked after him for a few days, and then handed him over to a Catholic institution. He thought he should do something like this when the same story repeated itself. He couldn't send people like this to some other place. He wanted to start something. So he started a small home, which is now a large institution, housing about 300 residents in a rural area. He arranges for caring, treating, re-stabilizing, restoration, and to return to families. Funds involved are minimum. Staff available very low. However, social capital very good. Hope, optimism, compassion, kindness, adjustment, non-critical environment are available here. This organization is progressing very well. Rural, low cost, less common, less demanding, and untrained into innovation. Now, these three organizations are different in the founders being of different type, the incentives, the triggers, the location, methods applied, policies and planning, but they are all doing well. So anyone reading can go through this and see which of them suits what they are planning and can do beautifully with it. The first project, starting with the three founders, developed the organization, that is SCARF, with rehabilitation as the first objective, and many other essential programs needed to be started to achieve this project. More modern in its introduction of fresh understanding, new methods of interventions, adopting what suited with the assistance of research being done and awareness being created. It has expanded to include community work, education, training, international relationship, including more areas of research and service. My congratulations to all those who worked to reach so far, and hopefully will reach the goal which I am dreaming of. Let us then be up and doing with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. Dear friends, Nandri, Meherbani, thank you, merci beaucoup, Gracias, Dankeschön, and all that I don't know. Thank you very much. Nice been meeting you all. Thank you.
Now you can show the.
The book. This is the book. I couldn't hold it all this time. That's why I kept it by Saraceno. Will talk about this. Will receive this from me.
Dr. Saraceno?
Yes,
Yes.
thank you.
You're virtually receiving the book right now.
That's right. Thank you very much. And good
Yes.
afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Isn't that wonderful?
It is marvelous. It is marvelous. Good afternoon, distinguished delegates, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon from Geneva. Dr. Sarada Menon, you are a great woman. This is not just my humble opinion, but it's the opinion of so many people across the world. Professionals, scholars, patients, family members, common people. For so many years, you have been an example of what a mental health professional could and should be. Highly competent, committed, innovative, passionate, and compassionate. I could say endless wonderful things about you. And all the people who admire you already know the gold list of gold virtues. Let me just tell you something more personal. I recently published a book whose title is Global Discourse and Local Sufferings. You are in this book as a professional and as a moral reference for all the world, as one of my most emotional, important, and unforgettable encounters in my life. The positive and marvelous impact you had on my brain and on my heart occurred to many others in India and outside India. Your greatest achievement has a name, and the name is Scarf. I repeat here what I said in other occasions, but it should be repeated and repeated and repeated. Scarf is one of the unique organizations in the world operating at the intersection of science and social commitment, ethics and praxis, global thinking and local action. When I was in WHO, I worked and I visited more than 60 countries, but never I met such an incredible combination of science, passion, social commitment to mental health care of underserved populations. Indeed, SCARF has taken seriously the notion of biopsychosocial, and it represents an outstanding best practice which should serve as a reference for the world. Madam, you and your beautiful child, Scarf, are the living demonstration of how the south of the world could be able to teach and lead the north. Please accept the book, Scarf, Caring for the Mind, a journey of 35 years and counting. 250 pages of pictures, statements, memories, and informative data showing the incredible amount of work done by SCARF in more than 30 years. This book describes the broad range of activities from clinical work to community outreach, from psychosocial rehabilitation to research. Finally, the book provides also many personal and emotional images of the Scarf family, and especially of Dr. Sarada Menon. It is a splendid necklace of flowers, where each flower is a testimony about you and about your fundamental contributions. This book is dedicated to you, Dr. Menon. Madam, today we honor you simply because you deserve to be honored. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saraceno, for a very, very emotional words that you said you have spoken today, and it also gives us a sense of the close relationship that you've had with Dr. Menon over the years, and I hope this will continue so in the future as well. I now request Dr. Mohan Agashe, another great friend of SCARF, to say a few words about Madam and of course about SCARF. Over to you, Dr. Agashe.
Thank you very much. I am indeed so happy that though pandemic, thanks to this online communication, that I'm actually can be with you all today, including Dr. Sarada Menon, Saraceno, Tara, Padma to you, our orator. As you know, this pandemic has caused a lot of psychosocial issues. And this is the right time to come out with a book on SCARF. So what has been done even on other occasions, and so there is hope even now that something still can be done. As I was growing up, particularly in psychiatry, like in any other field, you always look for your idols. And when I was in search of such people, I was fortunate enough to come across a few of them, but the name which is carved on my mind is of Dr. Sarada Menon. The reason is also because of my other side of my activity. As many of you know, I'm closely connected with acting in theater and films. And eventually I recognized I realized that actually they are complementary to each other. And in those times, what a coincidence, or it's a fact, probably only in India that I came across these 4 gigantic ladies in 4 fields. One of them was Dr. Sarada Menon in mental health, other was Pupul Jaikar, third was Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, and Kapila Vachaya. I'm so fortunate. I don't think in any other country, even in progressive country, we have found such women who give tremendous inspiration to the growing people. And Sarada Menon has always been a source of inspiration when I was studying to be a psychiatrist.
Good, Mark.
Well, that's not left to you, man, because you never know. And it's because being trained in biological psychiatry, unfortunately, today, even today, I will say, our medical colleges heavily emphasize the biological model of illness and health. Unfortunately, unless you have subjects in your pre-medical or first medical year, you do not come to know the significance and the vital nature of the social and psychological dimensions of health. So therefore, this biopsychosocial model is the most comprehensive model which has been taught to us by you, later by Vinkoba Rao, Dr. Vic, and I was fortunate enough to meet people like you. But my constant endeavor has been to go to Chennai because what you started was so well developed and brought to this like a complete tree, which is on the book, by all these women like Tara, Padmavati, Mangala, and so many others whom I kept meeting every 2 years in the SCARF conference. And whatever I could not gather in 1 year, I was able to gather in those few days. And that reinforced my belief that if at all one has to choose what exactly is health and between physical and mental, I came to know there are no separate entities like that. And if at all there has to be one, it is only health related to mind. I strongly believe even today, mind, though is not an organ, and I always tell my students, mind is the function of body. And body is a temporary residence for the mind. The fact which has come to us traditionally from Patanjali time till modern medicine, that mind is akin to our original concept of God, because are you there? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, you are audible. Yeah,
Audible?
you are audible. Yeah.
I'm good. So as I was telling you, that the body is temporarily a residence of mind, like music is the temporary residence of an instrument. The instrument disappears, the music doesn't. Mind comes in the form of our conventional concept of God, which is not a deity. God is not a physical form. God is Pancha Mahabhuta, sensations. So it does not have an odor, it does not have a smell, it does not have any of those bodily sensations from which you perceive body. To perceive mind, you need to go beyond physical sensations to perceptions, comprehensions, and more than the physical reality, psychological and spiritual reality. We are fortunate enough to have it in our collective unconscious. But you made us aware of this. You also made us aware that women definitely is a species more latest much after men. And so these species-specific perceptions and foresight and vision can really take the form like they have taken today of scarf. Those who are of that age of which I was when I met you first, for them, this book should serve like a holy book. It should be like Quran, Bible, or Gita to the students who in any form are concerned about mental health, because this outlines exactly how a seed grows into a tree and offers its shadow to so many people. This book is a living demonstration of growth of scarf, the very first activities the scarf has done, and wonderful way in which it has been penned with fantastic images, good text, and I hope one day we should be able to bring this book also in audio-visual format. Like today I have story tells, we should have a story of scarf with sound, images, and the text to suit the modern technological development. There, this language of emotion, primarily which is image and sound, and the language of intelligence, which is word, particularly a written word, all this coming together so that those who try to follow the book follow it at all three levels, at a conscious level, at a subconscious level, at an unconscious level. One reading of this book is not enough, because 3 times I've tried to go through it. Every time I have found something new. And so I'm sure those who sincerely care for mentally ill, for mentally healthy, and to live in unison with the nature, they will do repeated readings of the book and then find their own source and own development. I heartily congratulate this wonderful team Tara put together for this book, and I also appreciate the foresight of Dr. Sarada Menon, particularly identify and get all these competent women together under the. So every time I visit Chennai, scarf is always on my list. And I not sincerely thank you, Dr. Sarada Menon. I'm sincerely obliged to you and to many others, because without saying a word, you have given us what every student in psychiatry should get. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Agashe, for another emotionally, your thoughts were so full of emotions that it really brought to light your perceptions of what Dr. Sarada Menon is and what SCARF is today. Thank you very much for being here with us today. We now move on to the second part of the program, which is the oration. Why did we think of an oration? We had the first one during Icons in 2018 when Max Birchwood had delivered the first Dr. Sarada Menon Oration. This year, thanks to the pandemic, the icons was not to be. But we really didn't want to lose the momentum of an oration in Dr. Sarada Menon, and with Dr. Menon being present, it's really something that we felt was very, very important that we carry on this program. And Dr. Francis Dark readily agreed to deliver this virtually, although it's pretty late in the night for her. She said, never mind, this is the time that we can all get together with most parts of the world. At the cost of sounding a little repetitive, I must say a few words about Dr. Menon. Dr. Menon is an exceptional name in psychiatry. I don't need to repeat this because I know all of you who are gathered here today are here because of Dr. Menon. But why an oration and why psychosocial rehabilitation? This is something we need to understand. She has been instrumental in bringing visibility to psychosocial rehabilitation for persons with serious mental illness, and that's what SCARF is all about. Extensively involving families in the whole business of psychosocial intervention, she's actually given a new meaning to the word resource mobilization. And every time I see her, I learn something new about what this resource mobilization could be. I mean, over 36 years and counting, she's still around she's still, whenever anyone visits, and she's always wanting to see, young people around her. And she's always telling us about what are the things that we could do. What was applicable 36 years ago continues to be applicable in many ways even now. A very committed person and a passionate teacher, she continues to, I think, talk, live, breathe mental health. And when we recently, just this week, beginning of this week, when Dr. Tara and I visited her at her home, she was actually telling me about all the publications that Professor Helen Killaspy has recently written, Professor Dark has recently written. I mean, which means she's actually, looked at technology to identify what is the latest in the field. And I think that's a page each one of us has to take from her book. And so it is, I think, very, very befitting that we have an oration in her name. This oration is really a tribute to Dr. Menon and to psychosocial rehabilitation. And having Dr. Francis here to deliver this oration is, I think, another very fitting decision that we took because of Dr. Dark's involvement with rehabilitation. And I'm very, very pleased that Professor Helen Killaspy readily agreed to chair this, because Dr. Killaspy herself has been very, very deeply involved with psychosocial rehabilitation. She's done so much of research in this field and has come up with so much of evidence for the effectiveness of specialist services for people with complex mental health needs. And not just that, it didn't remain in papers and publications. She's actually taken it to the level of a national policy. And I think that's where implementation of research becomes a very, very critical thing. She has held a lot of leadership positions where psychosocial rehab is concerned. And currently she chairs the AIMS Rehab Advisory Group and is the National Professional Advisor for Care Quality Commission for Mental Health Rehabilitation Services. So it's indeed really a matter of pride for us to have both of you on this platform together. And I now hand over to Professor Killaspy to introduce the speaker of the day and continue the proceedings of the oration. Over to you, Helen.
Thank you very much indeed, Padma, for the introduction. And it's a great honour and a great pleasure for me to be introducing the guest speaker, Dr. Francis Dark. Francis is the Director of Mental Health Rehabilitation Services in the Metro South area of Brisbane, Australia. She's also Director of the Queensland Deafness and Hard of Hearing Service. She's spent her career working to improve the quality of care and outcomes for people with more severe mental health problems, with a particular focus on ensuring people have access to evidence-based psychosocial interventions. She has particular expertise in cognitive interventions, including cognitive remediation and social cognition interaction therapy, and she's delivered service-wide training programs locally in her own area in Queensland, but also abroad. And she's also delivered high-quality trials in both, with numerous associated publications on these and other topics. She's also put a huge amount of time and energy into developing her local services, including 3 very contemporary community rehabilitation units, which also employ peer workers on the staff. Before I hand the stage to Dr. Dark, I just wanted people to note that we will have hopefully some time for questions at the end of Dr. Dark's address. So if you do have any comments or questions, please put those into the chat line and we'll do our best to respond to those. But without further ado, I'd like to invite you, Francis, to take the virtual stage to deliver the 2nd edition of the Dr. Sarada Menon Oration on resilience in the context of a global health crisis.
Thank you, Helen. Right. I'd like to thank Thara, Padma, and the organisers of this oration for inviting me to speak. I'd also like to acknowledge the journey you've all been on this year and continue to be on, which for most has been far more challenging than what I've experienced in Queensland, Australia. But as a global community, we've been on this journey together. In times of crisis, we can look for leadership and inspiration. And these are qualities that Dr. Sarada Menon embodies. In preparing for this oration, I was impressed by an interview Dr. Menon gave in August of this year at the age of 97, and the relevance of the comments she made to the topic of resilience. I've taken 2 quotes from this interview. The first was about Dr. Menon choosing psychiatry as a career. And I quote, "When I chose psychiatry, my family, friends, and teachers were very much against it, but I'd made up my mind. I was impressed by this tenacity, determination, and vision evident from a very young age." The next quote is in relation to setting up SCARF. "We started with a passion for work to improve the future of the mentally ill people. We used whatever we were able to get, did what we could, and will continue to struggle." This quote brought to mind the sustaining power of passion, perseverance, and belief in a positive future. So it's an honor to present the Dr. Sarada Menon Oration. To begin my address, I need to have a disclaimer. I'm not a resilience researcher, but I do think resilience is something we've had to reflect on this year and find within ourselves. The history of resilience research is relatively new, dating from around the 1970s and influenced by a number of studies following major disasters. Some of these were man-made, like war, but also disasters like in Aberfane in Wales in 1966 and Buffalo Creek in 1972, when coal slags caused havoc and loss of life in small communities. There's also responses and research following natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, and bushfires. Resilience has been a difficult topic to research, and the construct has been difficult to get a consistent definition on. At times, this inconsistency has been a reflection of the different unit of analysis. Sometimes with resilience, we're talking about individual resilience. At other times, we're talking about community resilience. Perhaps the common elements in all definitions is the idea of being able to adapt positively to stress and to retain some functional stability. Colloquially, the concept is being able to bounce back. Early on, resilience researchers were interested in factors associated with resilience, and researchers included Sir Michael Rutter, who wrote a very influential paper on the topic in 1985. But researchers started to realize that the majority of people didn't succumb to adverse effects following even significant stressors and disasters. And the next phase of research really looked at whether there was an innate capacity for resilience, whether in fact that our systems operate to reset despite adversity. Child and youth researchers and resilience researchers, though, started to look at prevention and intervention strategies. And as is consistent with this domain of work, child and youth researchers, there was interest in the developmental timing, not only of the adverse event, but also ways of addressing and building resilience depending on the developmental stage. With the maturing of the field, there is an integration and engagement with the complexity of resilience and using biopsychosocial paradigms, including research on the neurobiology of resilience. So modern definitions will often reflect this, and Hill defines resilience as a dynamic process by which a biopsychosocial system returns to a previous level of functioning following a perturbation caused by a stressor. But we need to know what the nature of this current threat is. And if we reflect on the year, it unfolded very quickly. Initially, it was unclear of what the organism was. Very quickly, it became clear that it was a novel coronavirus. And by February 2020, the name and title COVID-19 was given. The virus is a single-strand RNA virus found in animals, and like other coronavirus, is able to cross species barriers and usually manifests as a respiratory illness with a range of impacts from asymptomatic to mild to moderate to severe. In fact, 80% of transmission is caused by pre or asymptomatic cases. The virus is extremely contagious, and by March of this year, the World Health Organization had delineated it as yet another pandemic. Throughout the year, we've had mainly, supportive therapeutic strategies, and the main weapon has been prevention. About 1 in 5 people succumbing to the virus will have a poor outcome. The spread is by aerosol and thus the contagious effect. It's relatively resistant to cold, but is inactivated at temperatures above 27 degrees Celsius. It's also inactivated by lipid solvents. It stays and lasts on surfaces like plastic and steel for 2 to 3 days and on cardboard for 1 day. Although mild to moderate cases might present like an upper respiratory tract infection, other symptoms like loss of taste and smell and diarrhea and vomiting can be signs of these mild cases. In around 30% of cases, though, there will be associated prolonged fever, a dry cough, resulting and continuing on to respiratory failure. There are also cases of system collapse due to sepsis. The course can be quite surprising in that over a course of a week, there can be a seemingly response to supportive treatment only for further deterioration. So if people needed to go on ventilators, it would often be for 1 to 2 weeks. And so of our populations around the world, there are certain groups that were vulnerable. And these can be categorized by age. Children appeared to be less biologically vulnerable, but they were dependent on the family and social systems such as schools, which were severely disrupted by the virus. We need to keep in mind that schools are often refuges for children in dysfunctional households. And with us all having to socially isolate throughout this year, there's been a rise in domestic violence. There's also a need for a developmental perspective, and the CDC in America developed resources for a wide range of age groups. This is important as particularly youth in the older age groups are more outward looking from the family. They had their routines changed, they were lost physical contact with the peer group, there was breaks in their education, and significant life events had to be put on hold, like graduations and formals. In our headspace facilities in Australia that are particularly designed for the youth of 12 to 24, over a month, they had 3,500 presentations, and of these presentations, 50% of these youth referred and endorsed a reduced confidence in their future. Despite this vulnerability, this age group were more likely to use technology to stay connected with their peer group. We also quickly learned that people living in institutions were vulnerable. Our aged care services were ill-equipped, both in terms of infection control and staffing numbers and staffing skill. Prisons also became incubators of the virus. People being placed in quarantine were at risk of adverse, particularly psychological outcomes. And people with long-standing illness, including long-standing mental illness, were vulnerable. My group were interested in whether the people we look after with serious mental illness actually got the information they required to adapt to COVID-19, and whether their mental health was adversely affected by the pandemic. We surveyed 20 people in our rehab teams. All had good knowledge of COVID-19. They were discerning about their source of knowledge, relying on news broadcasts with health officials giving the news. They also were understanding about changes in mental health care delivery, particularly going from the usual face-to-face delivery to using more technology to stay in touch with them. They did miss groups and felt overall that their rehabilitation recovery had slowed, but that there were no major change, at least in self-perception of their symptoms, and no significant new symptoms, for example, COVID-19 anxiety. Indeed, I was impressed by one lady who reported positive effects of the pandemic. And this has been noted in the resilience literature, that sometimes under adversity, people find personal resources and community resources that they didn't know they had or didn't know were there. I'd like to quote what she said to me. "I'm now more socially aware, more mindful of where I am and what I'm doing. There've been good aspects. I'm not taking life for granted. Before, I took certain freedoms for granted. Now I take advantage of the belief that I control 95% of what I do." So one person, but again noted in the resilience literature that indeed some people do find positive strength out of adversity. But there is concern for those already marginalized. There's a compounding risk indeed for those who are unemployed, in poverty, in refugee camps, and the homeless. I'm going to refer to examples in Australia, but you will know of ones worldwide. In Australia, in November 2019, we had the worst bushfires in recorded history. By March 2020, 19 million hectares of land had burnt out, and there was loss of 3,000 homes and 33 lives. It was an estimated economic cost of around 20 million. But the nation's attention was diverted to COVID-19. And with this came a risk that we would become amnestic to the compound burden of those affected by the fires. I was reassured by the news tonight, where our Prime Minister was opening a memorial to 2 volunteer fighters who died fighting the bushfires. The memorial was a replica fire truck designed for children to play in and was co-designed by the families of the deceased. And their 2 young children were present at the ceremony. Early on, though, reports from China and publications from China alerted us to the risk, both physically and psychologically, for healthcare workers. Healthcare workers are particularly vulnerable because of exposure, but also the rapid spread of the virus meant that there were periods of time throughout the world where there was lack of personal protective equipment, and there were novel changes and challenges in work behavior, shifting to working in with PPE on, not being able to engage with patients through visors and masks. And staff would shuffle between work and home, where they'd often have to isolate as well. There were really ugly examples of discrimination and stigmatization against healthcare workers. Where I work, there's a supermarket across the road, and some of the healthcare workers were heckled when they went shopping. And although this is one of the examples of some of the negative response that can have a spiraling effect throughout the community, it was quickly countered by the supermarket opening special hours to for healthcare workers. Again, an example of the negative factors draining resilience being countered by a really proactive, positive response from the business sector. But in a study done in Turkey on the psychological resilience of healthcare professionals, some of the risk was articulated in more detail. Bosdag and Ergen surveyed 214 health workers. 56% were women and 44% men. 66 were doctors, 69 nurses, and 79 other health workers. The age range was between 20 and 65, with the mean age being 33. The work hours were a wide range as well, between 7 and 96 hours. What they found, which has previously been noted, that resilience did rely on basic physiological needs being met, like sleep and nutrition. But they also found that people with a positive outlook generally on life and high life satisfaction appeared to be more resilient. There did seem to be more resilience in older workers, but for workers with dual responsibilities of work and children, of which 55% of this population tend to find that they were more stretched and their resilience compromised by those dual responsibilities. In addition, doctors appeared to be more vulnerable, and the researchers were concerned that workload and the burden of responsibility particularly contributed to this vulnerability for doctors. To shore up resilience, many services, like the hospital in which I work, establish well-being services, providing advice and resources to support staff. One of our research institutes, the Black Dog Institute, also noted that health workers may be at risk from watching patients die who would have been saved in normal circumstances. And they referred to this as a moral injury that could have long-term consequences for staff, mental health and well-being and morale. And points to one of the issues in research on resilience, that cross-sectional studies can only tell us so much, and it's going to be the longitudinal outcomes where we will find more about resilience following COVID-19. In my role as state lead of the Open Disclosure Program in Queensland, I train staff in communicating following adverse events in healthcare. I was asked to write a guide to help staff communicate with family in situations related to COVID-19. This request was characteristic of the pivoting of roles and skills that were required this year and the need for simple but clear and effective communication. And again, for staff faced with having to have challenging conversations with families, we rely on a very simple acronym. So the acronym is STARS. And it may go like this. For example, somebody's relative being admitted to ICU. I'm sorry, but your relative is not responding to care. To make them as comfortable as possible, we'll be moving them to supported care measures. You need to invite them to tell you what they're experiencing so they feel understood. I know you are anxious about your father coming into ICU, and this was the outcome we wanted to avoid. Tell me what it's been like for you with your dad in hospital and not being able to visit. It's also important to answer questions as honestly and as factually as you can, keeping in mind that some of the information, the facts may not be available to you. It's also important in the response to validate the emotional reactions, which is often going to be fear and anxiety, but try and assist people to cope by giving them clear information about what will be happening, in this case for the relative in ICU. And again, repeating the apology and making sure the family are put in touch with support systems, including chaplaincy service or social worker. But resilience also relies on very practical support. And in Australia, there were things like supermarkets turning to home deliveries while everyone was in social isolation, governments giving payments to the unemployed to help them get through, banks delaying mortgages. And so these practical supports is known, particularly from disaster research, to make a huge amount of difference in terms of people's adaptation and long-term coping. But in addition, communication had to be really clear communication that was able to be understood by the population at large. As indicated in our survey, we were pleased that indeed the communication given was able to be understood by people that I look after in the rehab services. But we did fail in Australia, particularly for our multicultural population, in not delivering information in other languages or using those multicultural communities to help disseminate key public health messages. One of the great advantages of COVID, which I hope will continue, is our news is being signed. And as Helen said, I am the director of the Queensland statewide deafness and mental health service. And unlike many countries in the world, we don't usually have our news signed. And this is a huge disgrace, and I'm hoping it's one of the things we'll retain after COVID. But also there's been development of online well-being strategies, and people of necessity have turned to technology to find ideas about how to cope. Some of these have been counseling type interventions. Some have been exercise programs, yoga and Pilates to balance physical health as well as mental health and well-being. In addition, we realized that it was necessary to screen and monitor people who are diagnosed with COVID. Can resilience be trained? Well, Joyce in 2017 did a meta-analysis of resilience training. Out of 437 papers, only 11 randomized controlled trials were suitable to be included in the meta-analysis. In these 11 trials, the interventions could be broadly grouped as CBT, mindfulness-based or mixed interventions, and together, these interventions were of moderate effect of about 0.44. with a confidence interval of about 0.23 to 0.64. But on sub-analysis, there appeared to be a slight advantage for mindfulness and mixed approaches. Now, there's a number of qualifiers for this study. They were based on small studies, there was moderate heterogeneity, and there were issues in the diversity of the resilience measures used. And it was unclear about the core structure of effective interventions. But probably what was common to all the effective interventions is what has often been referred to in resilience research as the 3 C's: control, coherence, and connectedness. Some people refer to the 7 C's, adding competence, contribution, and coping. And so these interventions help to find meaning despite adversity. They help us to learn how to tolerate distress, how to engage in social support, and we've had to find ways of keeping in touch without physically being in touch, and how to take value-based action where we're able. It's important to note that interventions like mindfulness are deceptive in their simplicity. but validating, savoring ordinary experiences using our senses, stopping to breathe, or literally smell the roses. I often use mindfulness exercises when I train to focus attendees' attention. In a recent training I did on open disclosure, communication strategies after adverse health events, the feedback I got from the doctors was that they wanted more mindfulness, indicating to me that they see this as a simple strategy that's acceptable and also effective. Now, we know doctors are a hard group to tap into in terms of their psychological well-being, so I thought that was a great endorsement for a very simple strategy, and hopefully that may be another positive outcome from COVID in terms of doctors being more aware of having to look after their psychological health and well-being. But the scale of this pandemic, the pervasive nature and disruption to all aspects of our lives and all levels of our society, both nationally and globally, has meant that we really have to use a systems approach. Maston and Stefanardi, in an article this year on multi-system resilience for children and youth in disaster, reflections in the context of COVID-19, discuss how a systems approach enables an appreciation of our interconnected systems, and that a change in one part can have a cascade effect or adjunct effect to raise or lower resilience in other parts. A systems approach does facilitate us, all of us being in this together, understanding that we all have a responsibility and validates the significance of even the simple one-on-one interactions that we may have when we're out social distancing, perhaps going for a walk or exercising. But it also encourages responses of our governing institutions. In particular, we know that an individual response has been necessary but not sufficient, that a family response, again, has been necessary but not sufficient, that we've required the engagement of global organizations like the World Health Organization, particularly in advocating for access to personal protective equipment, and in the future to equitable access, particularly in the third world, for vaccines as they become available. But also there's the role of our national leaders. They have been extremely influential, and in countries who've contained the virus, these countries and national leaders have usually put health policy ahead of economic policy. That is, health policy trumping economic policy. And we can't underestimate the challenge this was for our leaders to hold the line. And they were holding the line recommended to them by public health experts based on sophisticated modeling, of which they may not have had any sophisticated understanding themselves. In Australia, our Prime Minister showed early, clear and strong leadership and was supported in press conferences by our Chief Medical Officer. Each state was responsible for setting up processes to contain the virus within their jurisdiction, with restricted movement in the state and within our cities. And so we couldn't move to other states in the country. And a bit like Europe, we're a big country, a big island. And so as Benedetto can't go back to Milano to visit his children, John and I couldn't go to visit our children in Melbourne. In Queensland, we had home isolation for only 3 months, but outbreaks in Victoria with spikes in community transmission resulted in 6 months of home isolation in Victoria and extended closure of borders between the states. As the virus went on, as the economic cost increased, the Prime Minister faltered and urged the states to open their borders. It was pleasing that the countervailing forces of the state leadership held firm and relying on modelling of community transmission, they used this to guide when they opened the borders rather than political pressure. And I'm not being critical here, I'm just illustrating how difficult leadership in this scenario has been. So we've had to rely on public health research and modelling coupled with superior communication means to translate public health messages in a way that would engage citizens to take responsibility, to understand why their rights were being asked to be suspended for a period and really for the greater good. And this messaging had to give a vision of why this abrogation of our rights for a period was necessary and a vision for where we were heading. The health system also had to pivot quickly to adapt to the challenge of the pandemic, but continue functioning, albeit in different modes. Working from home became a virtue and was encouraged and likely to be a legacy of COVID-19, at least in part. Face-to-face as the mainstay of healthcare was replaced by telemedicine and telepsychiatry, which exposed an area where there's possibly a technological divide. At this stage, I would like to give credit to my colleagues that I've been working with at SCARF. Over a period of a couple of years now, we have translated, or in fact, they have translated a cognitive intervention for people with psychosis into Tamil. It is a group-based intervention, and unfortunately, our pilot had to be suspended because of COVID. We are now going to go ahead with a pilot delivering this therapy one-on-one. Obviously, the effectiveness of these psychosocial interventions which have an evidence base but in a group mode, the evidence for them being delivered in different modes will have to be accumulated over time. But I want to give credit to the team at SCARF for their flexibility and ability to pivot, because it's really been a great body of work that we've undertaken together. In Australia, the business sector has also rallied with the government support to keep existing employees, but also in the example of the supermarket, proactively contributing to positive community resilience. Banks also made arrangements to allow the temporary suspension of mortgage payments. But I think we also need to give credit to our creative industry sector, because they came together and provided content that helped us emotionally sustain us and help us stay connected, albeit not in person. Sesame Street apparently did a program caring for each other to help teach children, young children, how to care for each other in the COVID scenario. Podcasts became our go-to entertainment, and amateurs were seen either singing opera from the balconies of units in Italy or playing the piano. And it really showed how our creative industries help to build resilience and connect communities, and also the importance of fun and joy in resilience. But a systems approach also acknowledged the global community. And I was interested to note an October edition of The Conversation had an article, What the Developing Countries Can Teach Rich Countries About How to Respond to a Pandemic. And these were hard learnt lessons from SARS and Ebola pandemics. But the key lessons from this, that these countries were able to turn and adapt for this new pandemic, really stood them in good stead. The importance of having a plan that can be adapted for future viruses, and also experienced and trained staff outreaching to communities is one of those lessons we can learn from the third world. But there is no way of minimizing the distress and ethical conflict that has occurred due to the restrictions on key cultural rites of passages for all of us. The feeling of unfinished business where family could not attend funerals is in contrast to where families didn't respect social isolation, and the reality of when social isolation didn't occur, as in weddings in the Gaza Strip that resulted in a surge in community transmission. Never has the need of the many conflicted so much with the needs and the beliefs of the few. So we have had to learn from the past this year, and I'm taking Machiavelli out of context, but I think there's a positive way of reading this quote, and that is about the overall strength of humanity. And of necessity, we need to learn from the past. We need to accept that there are forces that will drain resilience in our community, but also countervailing forces that also come from our own human shared experience that can build resilience. The last word I'd like to give is from a service user and an excerpt from one of her poems. And the poem's entitled Diamonds from Despair. And the excerpt is, look to the future and not to the past to find those things you want to make last. This life is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Frances. That was a really wonderful overview of what has obviously been an incredibly, well, difficult is such an understatement, but a bizarre and difficult year for everyone, and particularly lifted by the sort of inspirational side of your talk, that there have been positives despite all of the very many negative things that have happened. Now, I just want to check with Padma, because I think we are probably a little short of time to do any Q&A at this point. Is that right, Padma?
If Frances is fine with it, we could take a couple of questions.
Okay.
I think there were a couple of questions in the site.
Yes.
Really, yeah.
Is that okay with you, Frances?
Yes, that's fine. Yeah.
Great. Well, some very interesting comments have come in, and I'm sort of collating some of the comments into one or two sort of overview questions for you. One is really about the role. I mean, you talked very clearly about the role of leadership, the role of the state and statutory services, policymakers. I wondered if you had anything specific to say about NGOs in this context, because obviously every country is experiencing really very difficult economic fallout from the pandemic, and we worry a lot about how the NGO sector will keep going, and yet actually the NGO sector has also been crucial. I wondered if you had any comment to add to that.
Yes, I think hopefully the government will recognise how important these key organisations are in sustaining communities and help support them to survive. Now, that's very easy for me to say in a country that's, you know, relatively, yes, we'll have a mega debt like everyone else, but we're in a relatively healthy situation and probably will economically jump back. There is the danger, though, that we will lose some of the lessons learnt from COVID-19, and that is how important all of these organisations are to the recovery, but also during the pandemic, sustaining the community and outreaching, particularly to people who are marginalised. The NGOs do that work beautifully at the best of times and have really not dropped the game and their performance during this time of pandemic. I do hope that the governments recognise how important it is to sustain those organisations, that rather than being things that are optional extras, they are do need to be sustained. And we need to keep in mind there are new novel viruses waiting in the wing. I don't want to be alarmist. In addition, with countries like Australia, you know, our poetry celebrates that we're a country of droughts and flooding rains. We, with climate change, will have to be very good at adjusting to these disasters. And so in the future, in an ongoing way, we're going to need to have a very healthy NGO sector. The NGO sector have got a greater flexibility than many of us that are constrained by being government organisations. So definitely have a flexibility and adaptability in these situations that we sometimes don't have.
I agree. We can get very caught up in our own structures and policies. The other comment that came in was, I think, an interesting one that around, it's really about intersectionality. Obviously, whilst the pandemic has been raging, particularly thinking about the US, the Black Lives Matter movement also gained momentum. And in the UK, that's been interpreted in, I think, a very healthy way. There's now a much greater level of consciousness about the way in which minority groups have been at greater risk from the pandemic, but also that has led to a wider conversation about lots of ways in which they may be socially excluded. And I think we've sort of sped along the process of at least a conversation about equality. It's been accelerated by this context within which we're living at the moment. I wondered if you had any similar views about how it's impacted in Australia and other parts of the world.
Yes, look, it was one of those ethical and moral dilemmas because particularly the young and you know, my daughter in particular felt that it was a moment in history where she needed to be part of a march for Black Lives Matter. But was aware of the risk of needing to wear a mask and the risk of mass gatherings. But it really was something that, you know, it was so big, so important that people felt a need to make a statement. Now, it's important to realize in Australia, there was very little community transmission associated with those marches, mainly because of the responsible way, at least in Australia, that they were undertaken and with masks. And our Indigenous community in particular knew that their community was particularly at risk from the virus. But I think bringing us all together, the virus has tapped into our shared humanity, has virtually said we share more than we have differences. And color of skin is a superficial difference that adds diversity and interest to our lives. It shouldn't determine your future or the quality of life that you have. So I think there are really important issues, moral issues that have been raised during the pandemic, how to responsibly keep them and elevate them in a time of news almost monopolized by COVID has been very difficult. But it was too important not to bring to the fore. But I think the positive things from COVID is more about our shared humanity, and I hope that's something we don't forget. Yeah.
Absolutely, and we've seen a similar response, for example, to street homeless people, that in the midst of the pandemic, it was a great social change to intervene and ensure that nobody was sleeping on the streets. And those are the sorts of responses that you want the government and those who make decisions to be able to make all the time, not just in the midst of great adversity. Well, I'm going to stop interrogating you now. And I'd like to hand back to Padma, but before I do so, just to give my personal thanks for what I think has been a great lecture. Really enjoyed it, and it's wonderful always to talk with you, but also to be in the company of so many people who are so committed to working in the field of mental health rehabilitation. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Helen.
Yeah, thank you, Helen, and a very big thanks to you, Francis, for such a wonderful talk. I think a lot of us were able to relate to what you were saying in terms of resilience, and it's exactly what's happened globally. Is what I think is, I mean, and it's the way you actually related to research, the existing research and past research in different disaster situations was amazing. And thanks a lot for agreeing to deliver this oration, and I'm sure Madam will be very pleased that this has happened, although virtually. We would love to have you both, Helen and Francis, here in Chennai when the situation becomes better. And I take this opportunity to thank all the participants in this and there have been a number of people who have joined this and were also watching you live streamed on YouTube. So you're there globally, Francis and Helen, throughout. And my special thanks to Mr. Parni of Sun Pharma, who has over the past 2 weeks been constantly at it to help me put this program together. And of course, all my colleagues at SCARF. And we are really delighted that we could still hold, despite the scenario, we could still hold this oration. So thank you one and all for being here. And I wish you all a great weekend. Stay safe and take care. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.